Harry Cohn's cigar froze halfway to his lips. Across his massive mahogany desk at Columbia Pictures, the man everyone called Handsome Johnny was speaking in that soft, reasonable voice of his, the kind that made grown men confess their sins. But what Johnny Roselli had just said made absolutely no sense. "You want me to give Frank Sinatra the Maggio role?" Johnny continued, that perpetual smile never leaving his face, "because it would be the smart thing to do for Columbia Pictures." Cohn set down his cigar with trembling fingers. Outside his floor-to-ceiling windows, the Los Angeles sun painted golden streaks across the studio lot, but inside his office, the temperature had dropped 20 degrees. "Johnny, with all due respect, Sinatra's finished. His voice is shot. His career is in the toilet. The public doesn't want to see him." Johnny leaned back in his leather chair, adjusting his perfectly tailored cufflinks. "Harry, when have I ever steered you wrong?" That question hung in the air like smoke from Cohn's abandoned cigar. Because they both knew the answer. Never. Johnny Roselli had never steered Harry Cohn wrong. In fact, Johnny was the reason Columbia Pictures still existed. 3 years earlier, when Cohn had been desperate for capital to keep his struggling studio afloat, it was Johnny who had introduced him to the right people. East Coast people. People who didn't ask too many questions about collateral or payment schedules. People who trusted Johnny Roselli's word more than any contract. The loan had saved Columbia Pictures and Harry Cohn's career. But that same loan had also made Johnny Roselli a very influential man in Hollywood. And when Johnny Roselli made a suggestion, smart studio executives listened carefully, very carefully. "Frank came to me personally," Johnny said, lighting a cigarette with a gold Zippo. The flame reflected in his dark eyes for just a moment, revealing something deeper than casual interest. "He's desperate, Harry. His marriage to Ava is falling apart. The newspapers are crucifying him. His recording contract is finished. He needs this role like a drowning man needs air." Cohn shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. He had built Columbia Pictures from nothing, survived the transition from silent films to talkies, weathered the Great Depression and a world war, but sitting across from Johnny Roselli always made him feel like a small-town banker negotiating with J.P. Morgan. "Even if I wanted to help Sinatra, which I don't, I've already told him no, 3 times. The role of Maggio isn't right for him. He's a singer, not an actor." Johnny's smile widened, but his eyes remained cold as winter glass. This was the moment that would separate myth from reality, the moment that would spawn 1,000 stories about severed horse heads and blood-soaked sheets. But the truth was far more elegant than any Hollywood fiction. "Harry," Johnny said, leaning forward slightly, the expensive fabric of his suit rustling like whispered secrets, "let me tell you a story about friendship. You know my friend Abner Zwillman from Newark? Longy Zwillman?" Cohn nodded slowly. Everyone in Hollywood knew Longy Zwillman. He was the man who had provided the emergency loan that saved Columbia Pictures. He was also, though this was never spoken aloud, a very dangerous man to disappoint. The kind of man whose business associates occasionally disappeared on fishing trips and never returned. "Well, Longy's been asking questions about his investment. Seems he's concerned about the studio's future prospects. He's been wondering if maybe he backed the wrong horse." Johnny's voice remained conversational, friendly even, but every word landed like a hammer blow. "Now I keep telling Longy that Columbia is solid, that Harry Cohn is a visionary, that the studio's about to turn the corner with some big hits. But Longy, he's a businessman. He needs to see results." The silence in Cohn's office stretched taut as a violin string. Through the windows they could hear the distant sounds of movie production, cameras rolling, directors shouting, dreams being manufactured on sound stages. But in this room, only reality mattered. Hard, cold, dangerous reality. "From here to eternity is going to be a big picture," Johnny continued, stubbing out his cigarette in a crystal ashtray that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. "Academy Award potential, the kind of prestige Columbia needs, and Frank Sinatra, despite his current troubles, is still a name, still has fans, still has that special something that makes people care about his characters." He stood and walked to the window, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. Behind him, Cohn watched like a man watching his own execution. "You see, Harry, perception is everything in this business. Right now, people perceive Frank as finished. But what if they're wrong? What if giving him this role doesn't just save his career, but makes Columbia Pictures look like geniuses for believing in him?" Cohn's mouth felt dry as desert sand. "And if the picture fails? If Sinatra can't carry the role?" Johnny turned back from the window, silhouetted against the California sun like a figure from a film noir. "Then we learned something valuable about loyalty and friendship. And Longy learned something valuable about the quality of Harry Cohn's judgment. The threat wasn't spoken, but it filled the room like gas from a leak. Harry Cohn had survived 30 years in Hollywood by being tougher, smarter, and more ruthless than his competitors. But Johnny Roselli represented something that couldn't be outmaneuvered or outlasted. He represented consequences that extended far beyond movie studios and profit margins. "I think," Johnny said, straightening his tie with the precise movements of a man who never did anything carelessly, "that Frank Sinatra is going to give the performance of his life. Because sometimes when a man has nothing left to lose, that's when he finds everything he needs to win." He walked toward the door, his footsteps muffled by the thick Persian carpet that covered Cohn's office floor. Then he paused, his hand on the brass handle. "Oh, and Harry? I'll be sure to tell Longy how cooperative you've been, how much you appreciate good friendships. He'll be pleased to hear that Columbia Pictures is in such capable hands." The door closed with a soft click, leaving Harry Cohn alone with his thoughts, his fear, and the lingering scent of Johnny's expensive cologne. For several minutes, he sat motionless, staring at the door through which his visitor had disappeared. Then, slowly, he reached for his telephone. But he didn't call Frank Sinatra. Not yet. First, he called his assistant. "Get me everything we have on Frank Sinatra," he said. "Contracts, test footage, anything, and get me Fred Zinnemann on the phone." Because if Harry Cohn was going to roll the dice on Frank Sinatra's comeback, he was going to do it right. Outside, Johnny Roselli walked across the Columbia Pictures lot with the easy confidence of a man who had just solved everyone's problems. The afternoon sun painted long shadows between the sound stages, and the air smelled of orange blossoms and ambition. Johnny nodded politely to the various executives, directors, and actors who recognized him. They all knew him as a successful businessman with interests in entertainment, a man who seemed to know everyone and could make introductions that changed careers. What they didn't know was that Johnny Roselli had just employed a technique he'd learned 25 years earlier in a Chicago warehouse from Al Capone himself, the art of making an offer that couldn't be refused without making it sound like a threat. 3 days later, Frank Sinatra received a phone call that changed his life. He was at home in his empty Holmby Hills mansion, the one that Ava Gardner had helped him pick out during happier times, the house that now felt like a mausoleum of broken dreams. When the phone rang at 3:17 p.m., he almost didn't answer it. Too many calls lately had brought bad news. Canceled recording sessions, refused movie roles, lawyers with bills that needed paying. But something made him pick up the receiver. "Frank, this is Harry Cohn." Sinatra's heart started beating faster. Harry Cohn had refused to take his calls for weeks. "Harry, what can I do for you? I've been thinking about our conversation regarding From Here to Eternity. Maybe we should give you a screen test for the Maggio role after all." Sinatra's response was immediate and emotional. He wept. Right there on the phone. This man who had once commanded stages across America, who had made Bobby Soxers faint with desire, broke down in tears of relief and gratitude. "Harry, I don't know what changed your mind, but I swear to you, I won't let you down. I'll give you everything I've got." And he meant it. Over the next week, Frank Sinatra prepared for that screen test like a man preparing for his own resurrection. He studied the script until he could recite every line of dialogue in his sleep. He worked with acting coaches to capture the essence of Maggio, the tough but vulnerable soldier who reminded everyone of themselves or someone they knew. He lost 15 pounds, got a military haircut, and immersed himself completely in the character. The world had written him off, but Frank Sinatra wasn't ready to write himself off. When the day of the screen test arrived, Frank Sinatra walked onto that Columbia Pictures soundstage carrying everything he had left: his reputation, his future, his last chance at redemption. The crew watched him with a mixture of curiosity and pity. Here was the man who had once been the biggest star in America, reduced to begging for a supporting role in a war picture. Fred Zinnemann, the director, was professionally polite but clearly skeptical. "Whenever you're ready, Frank," Zinnemann said from behind the camera. Sinatra nodded, took a deep breath, and became Private Angelo Maggio. The cameras rolled and magic happened. Not the manufactured magic of Hollywood, but something real and raw and honest. Sinatra didn't just play Maggio, he became Maggio. Every ounce of his desperation, his pain, his hunger for survival poured into that performance. The scene they were filming was Maggio's confrontation with the sadistic Sergeant Fatso Judson, played by a young actor named Ernest Borgnine. As Sinatra delivered Maggio's defiant lines, something extraordinary happened. The crew stopped their casual chatter and started paying attention. The camera operator leaned closer to his viewfinder. Even the grips and gaffers found themselves watching instead of working. This wasn't just a screen test, this was a man fighting for his life through his art. When Zinnemann called cut, there wasn't a dry eye on the set. The director walked over to Sinatra, who was still trembling with the intensity of the performance. "Frank," Zinnemann said quietly, "that was remarkable. Absolutely remarkable." Harry Cohn, watching from behind the cameras, felt something he rarely experienced in his cutthroat business: genuine emotion. But there was more to Johnny Roselli's intervention than anyone realized at the time, because while Harry Cohn thought he was simply making a smart business decision, Johnny had been playing a much longer game. 2 weeks after Sinatra's screen test, Johnny received a visitor at his Beverly Hills home. Frank Sinatra himself, looking better than he had in months, stood on Johnny's doorstep with a bottle of expensive champagne and tears in his eyes. "Johnny, I don't know what you said to Cohn, and I don't want to know. But whatever you did, you saved my life. If there's ever anything I can do for you, anything at all, you just have to ask." Johnny smiled that enigmatic smile of his. "Frank, just give the performance of your life. That's all I ask." What Sinatra didn't know was that Johnny Roselli had just acquired something more valuable than money or power. He had acquired loyalty from one of the most influential entertainers in America. The role went to Frank Sinatra, and the rest became Hollywood history. From Here to Eternity opened in August 1953 to rave reviews and massive box office success. Sinatra's performance as Private Maggio was universally praised, and the film became a cultural phenomenon. When Academy Award season arrived, Frank Sinatra won the Oscar for Best Supporting Actor, beating out more established dramatic actors. The movie itself won 8 Oscars, including Best Picture, and became one of Columbia Pictures' most profitable and prestigious films. Harry Cohn, who had been reluctant to even give Sinatra a screen test, found himself hailed as a visionary for casting the troubled singer. But the real genius of Johnny Roselli's intervention revealed itself over the following years. Frank Sinatra's career was indeed reborn. But more importantly for Johnny, Frank's gratitude translated into access to the highest levels of Hollywood society and eventually to political circles that would prove invaluable. When Sinatra formed the Rat Pack, Johnny was often a quiet presence at their parties. When Sinatra campaigned for John F. Kennedy, Johnny's connections proved useful for causes far removed from entertainment. The favor Johnny had done for Frank Sinatra in 1952 would eventually help Johnny gain access to the most powerful political figures in America, connections that would serve him well during his later involvement with CIA operations against Castro. The story didn't end there, though, because 30 years later, when Mario Puzo wrote The Godfather and needed a scene to demonstrate the awesome power of his fictional mafia don, he reached into Hollywood legend and pulled out a tale that had grown in the telling. The story of Johnny Roselli's gentle persuasion became the story of a severed horsehead in a studio executive's bed. The elegant reality of implication and suggestion became the crude fiction of blood and gore. Puzo, who had heard rumors of mob involvement in Sinatra's casting but never knew the real details, created a scene that was far more dramatic than the truth. The horsehead that never was became more famous than the handshake that actually happened. Johnny Roselli, when asked about the Godfather scene years later by a reporter, just smiled that enigmatic smile that had served him so well throughout his extraordinary life. "Mario's got quite an imagination," he said, adjusting his cufflinks with the same precise movements he'd used in Harry Cohn's office all those years earlier. "Makes for a better story, I suppose. But the real story?" He paused, lighting a cigarette with practiced ease. "The real story is that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't fear, it's friendship. And sometimes the best way to get what you want isn't to threaten what people have, but to remind them of what they could lose." Those who knew Johnny understood the real lesson of the Sinatra affair. True power doesn't announce itself with grand gestures or dramatic threats. True power whispers. It suggests. It reminds you of friendships and obligations. It makes you realize that saying yes isn't just the smart choice, it's the only choice. Frank Sinatra never knew the details of how he got that role, and Johnny Roselli made sure he never would. Harry Cohn never spoke publicly about the conversation in his office, taking the truth to his grave in 1958, and Johnny Roselli continued moving through Hollywood like a shadow, solving problems, making things happen, and maintaining the delicate balance between two worlds that most people didn't even know existed. In the end, perhaps that's the perfect metaphor for Johnny Roselli's entire life. Reality was always more impressive than the myths people created around it. The horsehead that never was became Hollywood legend, but the handshake that actually happened changed everything.